Hello all. Hello. Hi Carmen.
Hi Manuel.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. So Carmen, I'll name you co-host, okay?
Okay.
So, who's presenting exactly? Is it you or it's Nadia?
Yeah.
It's
I
Nadia.
will be, I think, moderating.
Okay, perfect. And is Nadia WB3648987?
Yes.
Okay,
This is
so
me. Hi, Manuel. How are you? Hi, Carmen. How are you? Hi, Anna.
I'm very good. So let me name you a co-host as well. All right.
Okay, so I can share my screen.
Exactly. Could you try sharing your screen real quick?
Yes.
That's good.
Can you see it?
Yeah, we see it. That's perfect.
Perfect.
So I'll be out for 1 minute. Just need to go grab a coffee. Meanwhile, Carmen, if you want to admit people in the room, you're going to see a little ringer. And then you can admit people as they come. Hi, Anna. Well, hey. Oh, I think she's not. My phone is not. She's not hearing. All right, I'll be back in 1 minute. Okay.
Okay.
And when we start, I will.
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi. Hi, Anna. Okay, I'll be back in 1 minute.
Yeah.
All right, I'm back, Carmen. So Carmen, could you please tell me when people enter the waiting room, you don't hear any sound, right?
No.
Okay,
No,
that's
they
perfect.
are,
That's perfect. No, but sometimes we hear a little ping when people enter. But since Nadia is co-host, I disabled this, so this won't disturb her during the presentation. Hi, Lucas. Hi, Kibram. Hi, John.
Hello, how are you?
Very good. How are you?
Good.
All right, so the session is recording. I'll do a bit of housekeeping just before Nadia start, Carmen, if you agree. Just,
hello, John.
Hi.
Hello.
There we go.
Hello, Manuel.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good.
It's been a long time since we spoke, Ibram.
Yeah, it has been a while. Yeah, how are you?
Very good. Where are you actually?
I'm in Cairo these days.
Mm.
Yeah,
All right.
good. Hi, John. How are you?
Fine. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good.
Good. So we're waiting for Nadia, I think. She must be WB364987, I think.
I am connected, John.
Ah, hi, Nadia.
Hi,
Thanks.
how are you?
Fine.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Can you see the presentation on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I don't know whether we should wait for a few minutes. I don't know how many people are connected. I can see this.
We are 12. I think maybe we should wait a few minutes. People are still connecting.
Okay.
Nadia, oh, great. I was about to ask you to put your presentation full screen.
Okay, yeah.
Hello, Jane. I think that Jane is with us. All right, so we're now 14. It's 11:02. So Carmen, you decide when we start.
Maybe we can wait until I don't know, 2 more minutes till
Right.
05.
Perfect.
I'm from Latin America, so I understand that people sometimes don't connect exactly at the time it is supposed to be.
It's like this everywhere.
Maybe, Carmen, after you introduce the subject, John can say a few words about the initiative overall.
Okay, we can start with that. Yeah.
I was trying to stay low profile. I thought this was a research
cannot,
fellow
John.
initiative.
I can introduce the series.
I was even wondering whether I should be participating or not.
You are the pillar of this. You cannot stay low profile.
I'm trying to escape as the pillars without, so I have to.
No.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us, for being here this morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. This is the first series of these Research Fellows webinars that we started to organize together with Anna and Nadia. And you have received probably the invitation to present next year. So we really hope that this inspires you to send us proposals. And the idea is, maybe John, if he wants to, can add something, is to share among us research skills that might help us to our own research in the future. So the idea is to make it as collective and participative as possible. So thank you, Nadia, for being the first one to present. And this is all I have to say for the moment. So if John wants to add something. If not, Nadia can go ahead with the presentation.
Okay, no, I'll just, I won't talk long. Yeah, I think this this is part of our general thinking about how we can change the way a lot of the economic development work is done currently. Continue to observe a series of think tanks in the north who are really extremely dominant. I had again a discussion yesterday with people from UNICEF, and they were talking about a few consulting firms which really dominate totally the landscape for getting most of their research done. And so the Research Fellow Program is part of this reflection on why is that the case.
Hello.
Can you hear me, Anna?
Yes, Anna, can you hear us?
Oh, I think Anna's got a problem, but everybody
Yeah,
else can hear me?
Yes, everybody can hear you, I think.
Okay, good. Okay.
But Anna is having problem with her headphones, so I'll sort it out with her over Skype. Okay.
Okay. So PEP's response when we were created was basically saying it's a question of capacity, and we have to build capacity and train and mentor researchers, and we did that for about 15 years. But then sort of realized that that's probably not enough. There's a whole series of reasons why these institutions dominate so much. And so the research fellows did some surveying and some analysis of what are those obstacles. And one of the ones that came out were research skills. These institutions, I did my thesis at Oxford with the Center for Study of African Economies. We had seminars 2 or 3 times per week where people were presenting their new research and constantly exposed to a real depth of research. In the South, there are places that happens. There are very strong research centers in the South, but it's not sort of a regular situation. So it is often researchers find themselves isolated. Is our diagnosis. That was what our research fellows responded to us, and they needed to be exposed to skills. And so this research skill webinar is sort of a response to that, where we're saying, well, there's no, in the modern world, there's no reason we have to be physically together to work together as a team and learn from each other. And so I'm really delighted to see there's a strong response and that people are stepping up to the plate and offering to make presentations, to share their skills with others and benefit. And so yeah, I wish you the best of luck with this initiative. I see Lucas has got his hand raised, his actual hand raised.
Yeah. Is it possible to make a 2-3 minutes reflection about what we can do with this type of seminar? Is this a good time, or should I do it at the end?
I don't want to steal from Nadia too much, but maybe maybe we could maybe we'll just restrict ourselves. Let's say 2 or 3 minutes. That would be great to have any thoughts. Yes.
Just to say that I like the initiative a lot. My only concern is that it is the research skills that researchers have in the North are adequate to answer the problems societies have in the North, not to answer the problems we have in the South. So I'm not able to solve, when we talk about methods, we will end up a lot talking about how to establish causality. And of course, we know that all those, even in some cases, sophisticated statistical models are useful to answer small questions. Sometimes in the South, we have issues that are where you have economic problems linked with social problems, with political economy problems, issues that are much more complex, and that very specific methodology to deal with, to answer a very tiny, small question is not very useful at all to answer the problems that many countries have in the South. So for me, it is not only about researchers in the South learning how to estimate the causal effect. It is about people, journals in the North that should be more open to publish papers that answer more relevant questions for those who are in the South. So sorry for these 2-3 minutes.
Okay, no, that's great. And I think I would suggest maybe to the skills subcommittee to maybe just plan having another webinar where you just talk amongst yourselves about the purposes of this webinar series and I mean, I know you have a lot to say about this because we've been working a lot on these issues, the journals and all of that. So I don't think we can do it now, but that would be just have an open discussion rather than an actual presentation. To slot us a moment for that would be great.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So maybe we can set it up for beginning of next year. So before actually the actual seminar series continues to set a purpose and discuss among each other. I agree. Thank you, Lucas. So.
And just a reminder that this is one group. We have one just focusing on policy. We have another one focusing on discussions and results. And so because we are focusing mainly on research skills that we decided to put, but doesn't need to be only the methodology. I agree. Thank you.
Okay, so maybe we can pass the word to Nadia so that she can start her presentation, and after that we can have a time for discussion and questions. So Nadia.
Thank you, Carmen, Anna, and John. Thank you, everybody, for joining this presentation. So the objective today is a little bit to share what we already know about the measurement of poverty and inequality, the trends that have been observed before the COVID period and right after the COVID period, and then brainstorm a little bit on what can be done better, what are the remaining issues that are not well understood in terms of helping the battle against poverty and inequality. So we'll start the presentation by talking a little bit about the methodologies and challenges to monitor poverty, inequality, and shared prosperity, to identify the poor, and then present a little bit what we already understood about the impact of the many challenges, but mainly the COVID-19 pandemic on poverty. So in terms of monitoring poverty, there are different concepts. The most well-known and most used one is based on monetary poverty rates, which measure the portion of population whose welfare is below the national poverty line. And then identify the extreme poor, who are those who are unable to meet their minimum nutritional requirements. The notion of poverty gap, depth, and the severity of poverty, which both measure how far the population is from the poverty line and the inequality among the poor. And these concepts are particularly useful in countries where there is high prevalence of poverty. So imagine a country where you have 70% of the population living below the poverty line. In these countries, wherever measures are implemented to fight poverty, the results on the poverty rates will take a long time to materialize. So we can measure the progress better in terms of whether we have been able to bring the population closer to the poverty line rather than reducing the overall poverty rate. They are also useful for the implementation of social protection programs. So if the population is very far from the poverty line, then they will require a lot of assistance to fill the gap for them to meet their basic needs. Also, if there is a lot of inequality or high inequality between the poor, then we need some kind of different programs to meet the needs of the different poor based on their profile. So those who are very far from the poverty line will require some kind of form of assistance, different from those who are very close to the poverty line. Then the notion of international poverty, which is used mainly for comparison across countries and which is based on using a kind of constant poverty line between the countries. Now there are other measures of poverty that are gaining importance and attention. One of them is subjective poverty, which is the self-assessment of the population or people about their poverty status. So they may appear as non-poor in terms of monetary poverty, but they still consider themselves as poor. And this is really important in terms of meeting their aspiration. The multidimensional poverty, which cover the different dimensions on which the poor they can or the population is struggling. So, for example, people can even if they are able to meet their minimum consumption requirements, they're not able to access safe drinking water or basic education or electricity and so on. Then, so we'll look a little bit at the challenges for the measurement of poverty. So first, we need to decide what is the welfare component we're going to use. Is it consumption or is it income? And if it's consumption, what are the components that will be included in the consumption aggregate? If it's income, same. Then what is the threshold we are going to use to decide on whether people are poor or not? The comparability issues, either within the country over time or between countries. What type of weights we are using, either for the measurement of poverty, of monetary poverty, or for the measurement of the multidimensional aspects of poverty. So when we look at the literature, consumption is more frequently used as a welfare measure. And this is because it's closer to the concept of permanent income. Annual income is subject to high fluctuation. In some countries, particularly the poorest ones, income is really difficult to measure because of the high prevalence of informality, because of seasonality of work, because also people are either reluctant to inform on their income or because they don't know. So they're not keeping record of, if they are engaged in some kind of informal businesses, they cannot keep record of the income they are receiving. The concept of consumption right now used for the measurement of poverty is based on the seminal work of Angus Deaton and Salman Zaidi, paper of 2002. But now there are initiatives to revise this concept to have a more accurate and more updated measure of consumption. So right now, the measurement of consumption includes all the expenditures on food, whether it's purchased, received, or own produced, expenditures on clothing, education, health, transport, etc. But it excludes consumption or expenditure on durables. If they buy a car or if they buy a fridge, it's not included. Unless the country is able to measure the user cost of these durable goods. And some countries are able to do so, and this creates comparability problems between countries, whether they use they include these durables or not. Then consumption or expenditure on exceptional events like weddings, birth, any celebration, funerals, and so on are excluded. So even if we are able to set more or less clear guidelines on the measurement of the consumption aggregate, there are still issues on how do we collect the information on this. So some countries use diary. They provide a diary to the household and they ask them to record all their expenditure. Usually this is used for recording information on food consumption, but for non-food expenditure, usually they use the recall method. And the recall can be for 7 days, can be for 1 month, can be for 12 months, can be for 3 months, depending on the items. So usually they ask the household, you know, how much did you spend on such and such item during the past 15 days or during the past month and so on. The implementation of diary is quite complicated and it requires close monitoring from the enumerators who need to visit the household quite frequently to make sure that the household is kind of recording all their expenditure properly and try to remind them, you know, did you forget anything and so on. So that's why more now the countries are moving towards the recall. And this creates comparability issues over time because recall also has its own issues. People tend to forget, you know, even if I ask you, I mean, what did you eat last week? It's really difficult to remember precisely what did you eat, how much you spent on each item, and so on. There are also now movement towards using digital technology for the collection of household consumption or even income information. So usually the method was based on paper. And now people are moving to use to-copy technology, computer assistant technology, which allows a more accurate collection of this information. And this also creates comparability issues over time for the collection of consumption. And then once we are able to measure properly the welfare aggregate, we still have to proceed to some adjustments. So do we, because we need to measure this either in terms of per capita or per adult consumption. And then, so many countries just go for the easiest way, saying we're just assuming that everybody has exactly the same consumption within the household, and we divide by the household size. And even when we do that, we need to decide whether we include only the nuclear family in the household side or whether we include also extended family members. In many households, particularly in developing countries, we know that there are also, you know, maids, cooks, and who are relatives like cousins who are living in the household for a short period of time. And we need to decide whether these are considered as part of the family or not. If we are using the per adult equivalent measure, this assumes that everybody in the household have different needs. So for example, babies do not have the same needs as youth who do not have the same needs as the elderly. Women and men also do not have the same needs. But so they assume like a baby will represent 80% of the consumption of an adult. A youth aged 20 to 30 who is engaged in heavy and intensive labor work will have 20% more needs than someone who is aged 50. But this is also creating some issues because the adult equivalent measures differ from one country to another, from one organization to another. Like the World Bank has its own measures, the FAO has its own measures, and so on. And sometimes this is also, it's highly contested in the literature, because we assume, okay, a baby maybe will not consume as much food as someone who is adult, but at the same time, they have more needs in terms of medical expenses, in terms of clothing, and so on, which make them consume more at the end of the day. The other issue is adjustment for spatial differences between regions within the country. So we know that the cost of living in rural area is different from the cost of living in urban areas. And even within urban areas, some regions will have, like the capital, for example, will have higher cost of living than the rest of urban areas, and so on. So how do we measure these prices to adjust for the spatial price differences? So I mean, some countries, they collect detailed consumer prices for different regions. And then this makes it easier to adjust for these differences. In other countries, they will use different poverty lines for different regions. In other countries, they will just construct price indicators based on unit values. So when we collect, and this will use only information on food consumption. So they will collect information on how much did you spend on this time, what is the quantity, and then we divide the value over the quantity, and this will give us the unit value. So this is very highly used in different countries, but there are issues for the units. Many countries, like in Burundi, for example, we have over 70 different units of measurements. So we don't have kilo, liter, or pieces like for eggs. We will have a plate of potato. We will have a bag of potato. We will have a bottle of tomato. And we don't know exactly how much these units mean in terms of standard units like kilograms or milligrams or whatever. So, and so often in these countries, the enumerators will go to the markets and they will collect information that will allow them to convert these units. But this is extremely costly and tedious procedure. So once we decide on the aggregate and on the adjustment factors, we still have to decide on what is the food line. So usually we will say, like, those who are the food poverty line can be converted in terms of national currency or international currency based on meeting a minimum nutritional requirement. So we look at the food basket for a reference group of the population, usually those who are around the 2nd to 5th quintile of the, or decile of the consumption distribution. And we will measure their caloric consumption. We will measure the value of this caloric consumption, and we will convert it into the food line. But we still need to decide what is the minimum nutritional requirement. In some countries, we assume that a person will need a minimum of 2,100 calories. In other countries, we assume that the person will need 2,700 calories. And this depends on several factors. One of them is the characteristic of the population. Like in Senegal, people tend to be tall, tend to be engaged in heavy labor work, so they will need more calories. In other countries, like in Gabon, they are mostly employed in service sector. They are shorter, they are smaller, so they will need less calories. So usually we rely on the FAO estimates for the needs. And then we decide on the basic needs poverty line for the country. And this usually is based on adding an allowance for basic non-food necessities to the food line. So the easiest way to do it is to just calculate the share of food consumption over total consumption for the reference population. And if it's, for example, 70%, then we just multiply the food line, we just divide the food line by 70%, and this will give us the basic poverty line. Other countries, they do some different adjustments. So, and those who are extreme poor are those whose total consumption per capita will not allow them to meet the food line. It's below the food line. So they're not able to meet their minimum nutritional requirement. Those who are poor are those whose per capita consumption or per adult consumption is below the basic needs poverty line. Then, so the national poverty line is really important to understand the characteristics or the prevalence of poverty given the characteristics of the country. However, it's not useful for cross-country comparison because every country will have a different way of measuring its national poverty line. So this is how we came with the international poverty line, which will set a constant line for everybody. And according to the estimates that are used by the World Bank, we have $1.9 per person per day for low-income countries, $3.2 for lower middle-income countries, and $5.5 for upper middle-income countries. But even though this helps to resolve part of the comparability problem, we are still facing issues on the measurement of the consumption aggregate itself. So if in some countries, for example, the consumption aggregate includes durables, and in others, it excludes them. In some countries, they decide to take out, for example, expenditure on education or expenditure on utilities because they're not measured properly. So then these countries, when you use a constant threshold, these countries will appear as poorer than the others. But it's not because they are really poorer, it's because the consumption aggregate is lower since it does not include some of the components. We're trying to harmonize the databases provided by the stat offices to resolve this issue, but it's not always easy. Another thing that we need to keep in mind is that when we have the consumption aggregate, we do not, so we convert it like, let's say we have the consumption aggregate in national currency for the month. And we divide it in per capita terms, and then we divide it by 30.4 to have the daily consumption per capita. So we don't compare it to the $0.9. So if it's for 2017, we bring it to 2011 using the consumer price indicator. And then we use the purchasing power parity exchange rate of 2011 to convert it in international dollars. And then we compare it to the $0.9 or $3.2 or whatever threshold we have. So we don't use the exchange rate that is available on the website, and we don't use the years. We need to do these adjustments before. So in terms other issues, so we talked a little bit about the comparability issues that are related to the change in methodologies for data collection. So another thing like the items probe. So for example, in some countries, the enumerators are provided with a list of items they need to remind the household about for their consumption. Like, you know, how much did you spend on shoes? How much did you spend on socks? How much did you spend on books, and so on? And in the past, this list used to be quite aggregated. So it will include like 100, 200 times, but items. But now it's including more and more items. CAPI over PAPI and so on. But there are also other issues related to the sampling. So in many countries, the sample frame for the household implementation is based on the data from the census. So if meanwhile the country change or implement a new census, then the sampling frame changes. And this also creates comparability issues. In terms of the measurement of the multidimensional poverty indicator, the comparability issues are even more problematic, because first we need to decide what are the welfare dimensions we need to include in the MPI. So is it only human capital, access to basic services, and or does it include income on consumption? Within human capital, what are the sub-dimensions that we are going to include? Do we focus only on health measured by, for example, child mortality, or do we include also more detailed information on, for example, stunting, wasting of children, and so on? For education, do we focus on primary education or enrollment only, or do we include achievement as well? And then what are the thresholds? And this is really problematic, particularly for example, in a country where access to primary education is compulsory and universal, we need to set a threshold related more to access to, for example, higher education levels, secondary or tertiary. In a country where 80% of the population is still illiterate, so then we can put a lower threshold. Then what is the weight that we are going to attribute to the different sub-dimensions and to the different dimensions in terms of measuring the multidimensional poverty indicator? And then what is the threshold to decide whether a person is multidimensionally poor or not? So usually we tend to consider that people who are deprived in 30% of the dimensions are considered as poor. But it's not always the case. So now we have so OPHI did very nice work in kind of trying to set a very clear methodology for the global multidimensional poverty indicator, which is going to use very quite comparable sets of indicators, weighting, thresholds, and so on across countries. And this is mainly used for cross-country comparisons. And then you have the national MPIs. And the national MPIs, now more and more countries are using them, and they go through national consultancy, and they involve a lot of stakeholders, academia, civil society, nutritional institutions, and so on, to decide on the thresholds, on the dimensions, and so on. But there is still a lot of work to be done. So now also the World Bank is trying to come with a measure of MPI. But the most advanced work can be found with OPHI and UNICEF. Subjective poverty is more used, but it cannot be used for cross-country comparison. Because the problem is, if you take a person who is living in the urban area, so if your neighbor, for example, have a Mercedes, lives in a huge house, even if you are able to meet your basic consumption requirement, you will still consider yourself as poor, because you're comparing yourself to this environment where people have access to way more means. But in quite homogeneous settings like remote rural areas, for example, where everybody is poor. So if you are able to have enough food for the day, you consider yourself as being not poor. And we observe very large discrepancies between monetary and subjective poverty measures as we move to richer settings. And this reflects to the fact that the aspiration of the people are unmet, and this creates some kind of tensions. So it's useful in terms of understanding these patterns, and these affect their productivity, they affect their behavior, and so on. But they're not very useful in terms of cross-country comparison or to set some kind of threshold overall. So in terms of measuring poverty, so just some data comment, probably many of you are already familiar with that. So you can go to Stata Help, download SEPOV data. So the most used command is SEPOV, and then you have the consumption aggregate, the weight, and the poverty threshold. So if you are measuring national poverty rate, so here you put the basic needs poverty rate, and then here you put the per capita or the per adult consumption. You need to decide on the periodicity. So if it's monthly consumption, then the poverty line will be set on a monthly basis, or if it's annual, then it's annual basis. If you want to have the decomposition by region or by gender, or by whatever, like household size, then you add the by command. So to address the comparability issue over time in many surveys. In the past, we used to use the POVMAP software, which was created by the World Bank. But this software is a nightmare. It's very unstable. It's complicated. So now more often we are using the me-impute command in Stata, which we tested for several countries and proved to provide very similar results to the POVMAP software. So since it's easier, this is what we are using now. And this, so me-impute has been created by Stata in the past to address the problem of missing information in some surveys like DHS and so on. If you want to run a regression and you have a lot of missing information because either people do not want to provide this information or because they don't want to give this information, it creates biases in the regressions and estimates. But now it proved to be useful for also cross-country overtime comparison for poverty rates. So and this is based also on the seminal work of Pete Laniu on the small area estimation technique. So the small area estimation technique was initially created to impute information from household survey into the census. So the census is representative at a very detailed geographic level, while households tend to be representative at quite aggregated geographic levels. So either urban, rural, or sometimes capital region or big regions, rural, urban. And then, so if we want to understand the concentration of the poor in some specific and granular geographic areas, we impute the consumption from the household survey into the census. And this will allow us to have a very detailed map of the distribution of the poor. So, and this methodology can be used similarly for imputing the consumption aggregate from the most recent survey into the previous survey and see whether the trends we are observing in terms of changes in poverty are real or they are driven by the change in the survey methodology. However, one drawback of this methodology is that it's based on using the regression factors that remain more or less stable over time. And one issue we observed is like, so imagine you have a survey for 2018, and then you have a survey for 2010. So we use the survey of 2018 to make the regression of the consumption on education, ownership of assets, access to basic services, and so on. We calculate these coefficients, and then we impute these coefficients to the same variables in 2010 to calculate the imputed consumption there. And when we do that, we will be able to see whether the real consumption is very different from the imputed one, whether the poverty rate that is calculated from the imputed consumption is different from the one we had from the imputation. And this will tell us whether this survey, whether the changes are real or driven by the change in the survey methodology. But if, for example, in 2018, 80% of the population do have a cell phone. In 2010, only 10% of the population do have a cell phone. We know that cell phone has a very big positive impact on consumption. They increase people's possibility to have more income and then to have more expenditure. And if we include cell phone, we see different trends from excluding cell phone. The hypotheses of the model are based on the idea that we should exclude any explanatory variable that had a big change over time. And this is something we have been struggling a lot with in many in many countries, and some governments where, like, if we tend to use regressors that remain stable over time, we usually see a flat poverty rate, and this creates a lot of political issues in the discussion. So sometimes we just have to make case by case decision on what we should do about this. Another thing that we can use, another command that we can use on Stata, and this has been created by the World Bank, is to examine the drivers of poverty change, is the ADECOMP command. But this to be able to do this decomposition, we need first information on the sources of income. And second, we need to observe quite substantial changes in the poverty rate. Otherwise, the model will just do not show important change. And we need also a kind of important time lapse between the two surveys, because the decomposition will use also the changes in the labor force or the adult population within the, oh, there is a mistake here. So it's per capita income, and then here it's, oh, it just repeated the ADECOMP, just take this out. But you can go to the Stata Help, see information about the ADECOMP. You can reach out. We can also share some papers about the methodology so you can understand it better. So what do we mean? So you see a lot, particularly in the World Bank reports, progress towards ending extreme poverty and promoting shared prosperity. And so ending extreme poverty, meaning bringing the global poverty rate using the $0.9 to less than 3%. Promoting shared prosperity means that realizing overall growth, but making this growth benefit more the poorest groups than the richest groups. And this means that the average consumption growth among the population that is at the bottom 40% of the income or consumption distribution is higher than the average consumption growth for the total population. And it can be measured simply by just comparing the average consumption growth for this population, for the bottom 40% and the average consumption growth for the total population to calculate the shared prosperity premium, or we can also use the growth incidence curves to see this pattern more in detail. So here we have the example of two countries where we have pro-poor growth and pro-rich growth. So if we look at the first graph, we have the horizontal orange line is the average consumption growth for everybody, and it's positive, okay? But when we look at the consumption growth for the population, in the 40 bottom percent, we see that even though they witnessed some positive changes in their consumption over time, it's way lower than the increase in consumption for the population in the richest groups. In this country, in the second country, overall consumption was not positive. So the country did not really achieve economic growth. However, when we look at the poorest groups, we can see that they have very positive changes in their consumption. However, the richer witnessed a decline in their consumption. This usually can be observed in situations where very strong redistributive policies are implemented. So both situations are not really good, because here we need to have also average positive consumption. Growth of the bottom 40% that is based only on redistribution measures is not necessarily positive, because it creates a kind of assistance spirit within the country. So what we need is to have a dynamic, prosperous economy where we have overall growth achieved and where we have the poor being able to use their capacity in a more productive way rather than relying on assistance from the richer groups. In the second situation, this will lead to kind of discrepancy between the richest and the poorest groups, and it can lead to some instability within the countries. So usually when we have progress towards shared prosperity, it's coupled with a decline in inequality, but not necessarily, because in some countries, the inequality between the poorest groups or between the richest groups may be increasing. So we don't see an overall decline in inequality. So now, so that's why we need to look at shared prosperity, but we need also to look at inequality measures. So how do we measure inequality? So the most common measure is the Gini indicator, because it allows comparison between countries. But Gini has its issues because it's an aggregate measure, does not tell much about if you have a Gini indicator of 40% in one country, we can say that yes, probably inequality is quite high, because we know that low inequality means that the Gini needs to be around 38 or something. Or if Gini is increasing from 38 to 45, then we see inequalities increasing. But we cannot say more than that. So for that, we need also other measures like percentiles, shares, like, you know, the share, or interquartile measures, like, you know, what is the share of the consumption or income of the 10% richest population over the 10% poorest ones, or the median over the poorest ones, and so on. We need the Lorenz curve, but these are also not very informative in some cases. So we need to look at whether the inequality is increasing within groups or between groups. For example, in some countries, we can have an overall decline in poverty, in inequality, sorry. But the gap between the urban and rural areas is increasing, or between the gap between the north and south is increasing. And this is sometimes leading to some kind of instability. If you have one region that remain constantly lagging behind the rest of the country, so it creates some social tensions and it leads to some instability. So we need to measure the share of inequality that is driven by changes between groups. And for that, we need the tail index, because Gini is difficult to decompose. We have also polarization measures. So this will inform whether the population is clustering around the lower part of the distribution and the top part of the distribution, while the middle class is shrinking. Polarization measures are very used, particularly in the labor market, to see whether these changes that are occurring in the labor market with the development of technologies and so on are leading to some kind of polarization. And now, more and more, we have Oaxaca decomposition used to be able to understand the changes across the entire distribution. So Oaxaca was initially created to just measure the changes in the mean. But since the seminal paper of Firpo, Nicole Fortin, and so on, published in Econometrica in 2009, we are using the Oaxaca decomposition across the different quantiles of the distribution. Then we need to keep in mind that inequality is not necessarily bad, but there are bad forms of inequality. Because imagine that all of us work in an enterprise, and no matter what, we will all receive the same salary, whether we work hard or not, whether we have higher education or not. Or imagine a classroom where everybody will have an A, whether they take the exam or not, whether they complete their homework or not. And then, so this kills initiative. People do not have to make any effort. And we have seen that in communist countries, where productivity has been lowered because there is no necessarily differences in rewarding effort. So we need to distinguish inequality that is driven by effort and inequality that is driven by some unfair factors. And this is the one that is the most, the biggest obstacle to the reduction of poverty and to achieving higher growth. And to give an example, imagine a boy who is born in a rural area where he has to walk 10 kilometers every day to go to school. He does not have a computer, he does not have access to internet, he does not have electricity at home. When he comes back from school, he will have to walk another 5 kilometers to bring some clean water to drink at home. And then another boy who has tutoring at home. His parents are educated, is helping him with his homework and so on. And this is the bad form of inequality that is going to affect the effort and the outcomes for the children. And this is the inequality that needs to be addressed. And so we usually rely on the work of François Bourguignon, Francisco Ferreira, and so on, to be able to separate the part of inequality that is due only to what's going on with my computer. Gosh. I'm losing my presentation for some reason. Just sorry, 1 second. Do you still see the presentation on the screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay, I don't know. It disappeared.
Because Manuel had to leave, so maybe there was something wrong with the hosting situation.
Okay. Let me see if I do that. Okay, no, it's back. Okay, so
I'm thinking that maybe you can round up in like 10 minutes or so, so we have time for questions and discussion after.
Okay, so I'll try to speed up a little bit. So
okay.
Here we have some stata commands. You can, we'll share the presentation so you can go through the stata commands for the measurement of the, for the creation of the quantiles, whether it's deciles or quantiles or percentiles, and then the growth incidence curves, the decomposition of inequality, the measurement of polarization, and so on. Just one last thing about the Oaxaca decomposition. So then we now, and this is very, very recent, Stata created the Oaxaca RIF decomposition, and this allows to do this kind of decomposition. So just to give you an example, usually this is used to understand the drivers of inequality between men and women, or between urban and rural, and so on. So it separates the drivers of inequality into two factors. One is the endowments. So take the example of men and women, where men are earning 40% in terms of wages more than women. Okay, this could be due to the fact that men do have higher endowments. They have higher education. They work in higher positions, or it could be due to the fact that even though men and women do have the same education level, or do have the same qualifications, same experience, men will still receive a higher return to their attributes than women. And this is discrimination. So this is what, or if we take the example of rural and urban area, income or consumption in urban area is usually higher than rural areas, because people in urban areas tend to have higher education. Okay, so then we say, let's go to urban areas and let's try to promote education. But will people still have the opportunity to increase their return? Go to a remote area where you have nothing except agriculture, and go with a PhD in econometrics. Will you get the return for your PhD in econometrics there? No, because you don't have the job opportunity to increase your income. No one needs your skills. So even if we try to put policies to improve the endowment, to close the endowment gap, we will still have to couple this with policies to improve the returns to this gap. So if we don't go to this rural area and try to put some community projects that will create a dynamic for creating productive jobs and to be able to hire this population, we will end up with two situations. Or this qualified person will migrate to the urban area, or this qualified person will work at a lower wage than his qualification required. And this is how this decomposition is useful. Now, to identify the poor, we usually do not have surprises. They are usually located in rural or remote zones. They have large family sizes, they lack education and access to productive jobs. They don't have access to basic services and assets. And we already know that we need to address all these shortcomings in order to improve the poverty situation. So just in interest of time, I'll focus a little bit on COVID and poverty. So COVID is a real problem, and it's one of the biggest challenges that the new world is facing, because it features simultaneous supply and demand shocks, regional. It has a national, regional, and international scope. It has been long-lasting now. Close to a year. It has a high degree of uncertainty and so on. And what happened with COVID is that now we see the emergence of what we call the new poor. So it had an effect on the already existing poor and very vulnerable population, but it created new poor. So what happened when we look back at the global trends in poverty since 1990, we have observed a very fast decline in poverty until 2010 or so. And then starting from 2010, this progress started slowing down because of the slowdown of poverty reduction in sub-Saharan Africa. But overall, we can say that the number of poor has been almost divided by 3, just to be optimistic. Now, the COVID is threatening to reverse the gains. So I put a reference to the flagship report recently published by the World Bank, where they did some different simulations, and we estimate that the number of poor people could increase by around 100 million in 2020 and reach 150 million in 2021. And that inequality is also increasing because the poor do have lower coping mechanisms to the pandemic than the richer ones. They have less savings, they have less employment, informal sectors, protected employment, etc. So how do we measure the effect of COVID on poverty? So there are different options. One of them is the simulation model. So I provided you reference to some publication where we have projection models. These models usually use a combination of macro-micro simulations. They have their shortcomings, but they can give an idea on the trends of poverty. And now we are implementing the high frequency surveys, which are either telephone or web surveys. So the World Bank is doing that, collecting information on households, firms, and community services, but other organizations are doing so. So we have UNICEF, Asia Foundation, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, UNDP, UN Women recently also implemented the survey to collect information also on the impact of COVID on gender and so on. And then we have the SWIFT surveys in the World Bank. So they are not different from the high frequency surveys. The only difference is that they collect information also on consumption to be able to make projections on the poor. So there are issues we're still struggling to fix this. One of them is the sampling, because if you are doing a telephone survey or a web survey, you're already selecting a certain category of population that is equipped with these means. So we need to, if we want to make the surveys nationally representative, we need to adjust for the weighting procedures. Others are the high rate of non-response, making sure also to avoid fatigue of the respondents And because we try to make this as panel surveys, so they're not reluctant to answer future surveys, or sometimes they drop in the middle of the survey. So we need to keep the questions to 10 minutes or so. And sometimes it's difficult to understand some trends. For example, in the previous round, we asked, what is the sector you are employed in now? Were you employed before March? Are you working now? And did you change job? But we don't know. If you have like 50% of the population of the respondents saying they changed job, we don't know where they did go. We don't know whether they were in formal employment. And the more you add questions and the more you take the risk that people drop in the middle of the survey or just do not answer. So we're trying to fix all these issues. So the preliminary results, and you can see that also in the flagship report I shared the reference to, is those who are, so in the past, the poor are those who are working in agriculture, they are employed they are located in rural areas and so on. But now, most of the sectors that have been affected by the pandemic are not agriculture. So we are observing a move back to agriculture, actually. So accommodation, I mean, hospitality services in general are the most affected. Domestic services, informal jobs, all jobs that cannot be done at home and they are located in urban areas are the most affected ones. And people working in these sectors were considered as being non-poor. And now they lost their jobs and they are falling either into poverty or very close to being poor. Women and girls also are facing disproportionate impacts. So there are the issues that are related to employment. They have to stop working because they need to take care of children or elderly people, or because in some sectors they are more affected by job cuts than men. We think because they are in lower profile jobs, they don't have permanent contracts and so on. So they tend to, so there is a very nice report by UN Women who feature all these facts. They are also subject to home-based violence. They are also more exposed to food insecurity because they tend to eat less to save for their children or household members, and so on. So this is basically what I have to say about this, and happy to discuss more.
Thank you, Nadia. That was very comprehensive and interesting. So now I would like to open the floor for questions or discussion. There are many things that have been addressed, like from definitions, methodology, or data from the recent trends. So yeah, Lucas, it's raising his hand.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for this very good.
I'm sorry, Lucas, just one comment for Nadia before. Can you stop sharing the presentation so we can see each other? Thanks.
Thank
Go
you
ahead.
very much.
Yes, I did. Lucas, can you just get closer to the microphone or something? Because also I can't hear you.
Here it works better.
Not really.
Oh, I will try to speak a little bit louder. Is this okay now?
Yeah, it's better.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for this very interesting presentation. Let me ask you a quite simple question about how to get a representative sample of the population. And let me illustrate the broader point with one example. In many Latin American countries, a large share of the population lives in an urban area, and in an urban area, the poor live in shanty towns. The favelas in Rio de Janeiro, villas miserias in Argentina, and people who live in these countries, we know that because we walk, we see, and we have an estimate of the size of the favelas, of the shantytown, where many of the poor live. However, the statistical agencies do not go into the favelas, do not go into the shantytowns because it is dangerous, because it is risky. So, for example, in a country like Argentina, and the main household survey estimates that only 1% of the population live in the favelas, and all those who live in the favelas are poor. However, people who have been doing social work there, we estimate that the size of the population living in a shanty town is between 5 and 10 times larger. So the basic point I am trying to make here is that then we can use sophisticated statistical methods. But first, we need a representative sample of the population. And in my understanding is that UN agencies are doing very little to solve this problem, to have a representative sample of the population, and particularly in this case, with the shantytowns. Thank you very much. So this is an example where a researcher located in the South have more understanding of the problems we face than those located in the North. The question is that they have to listen to us.
Can I add, Carmen, something to Lucas' question? Another point that's a polemic issue around Brazil is that we have a large social program, a conditional cash transfer. And it's a lot of people are afraid of losing the aid in the program. And so most are in informal jobs. So it's really hard to know the exactly measurement of income and because we don't have, it's all informal. And since they are afraid of losing their social program, they don't say the truth. So it's, although we have a lot of people that should be included, as Lucas said, we have another part that doesn't say the truth. So we are putting money and they don't deserve in the end of the story. So just to complement, thank you.
Ibram?
Thanks. Thank you for this interesting presentation. So I have a couple of more of ideas that, I mean, more of like points that I would have loved to see them Nadia reflecting on. So the first one is we know that from a measurement point of view, consumption is notoriously noisy, and I think recently what I see is some people are debating from or departing from the single shot measure of consumption or poverty that had been commonly used. And now I think I might be wrong, but I think now what I'm seeing is like a more seasonal measure of poverty, like where I think, for instance, I know one experiment where they they collect consumption data every month. And what they show, or what they argue in that paper, is the single shot measure of poverty that comes from the surveys, including the LSMS survey, is probably very noisy and not good enough to tell a story about the level of poverty. And I think I would have loved to see, or I would appreciate if you can reflect on that. And secondly, I think I have an interest in measurement, and I was also thinking, I mean, you somehow reflected a bit in some of the points, but I was also thinking, how improved measurement had also helped us get a better sense of the level of poverty in the different, I think, case that we are studying. Because I think I do see that people are now moving a bit from the traditional seven days, I mean, recall to perhaps a diary and a shorter recall period. And I think my sense is, I mean, I'm just guessing, I mean, but I feel that that improvement could have implication in terms of our understanding of the level of poverty and inequality, at least in different cases. Thanks.
Thank you. I have one extra question, and maybe then we can turn to Nadia again to start the discussion and see if other things come up after. So my question is related to more a reflection about the current situation and how poverty has, of course, changed due to the COVID pandemic and its policies to contain it. So my question is not so much related to how to measure poverty, and of course we had these different measurements and they are more or less adequate. But my reflection goes into the idea that there were a lot of households that were very vulnerable to falling into poverty, and they have fallen clearly. So, and that was because I think two things that are key are the condition of informality, which in Latin America it's very important, and also access to health services, which in other countries such as the US, it's very important as well. So how we should be thinking of incorporating this type of vulnerabilities also in the poverty analysis to be able to capture possibly effects of shocks that affect this type of households. So back to Nadia maybe, and then yeah, we can continue the discussion. We were supposed to end at in 10 minutes. I'm not sure how you are with your time and stuff, but maybe we can stay a little bit longer if it, but if anybody has to leave, of course, they are free to do so. So Nadia, please.
Well, thank you so much for these very challenging questions. I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but I think this is also an a way of brainstorming to the issues that need to be better understood, better addressed. So I will start with Lucas' point, and I think this is one of the key issues we're trying to deal with right now. So in the past, and I agree with you, most of UN agencies, including the World Bank, they were just going to whatever the NSO collect as information, provide the weight and so on, and we use it as a basis for the measurement of poverty or inequality, whatever information we need. But progressively, we started realizing that yes, there are a lot of large groups of populations that are not covered, either because they live in very remote areas, they are difficult to access, and so on. So I'm not a strong statistician. So there is a team within the World Bank that is really working on these sampling issues. And I'm still trying to learn myself on how they do all these things. But I know that there is now a large group that started working on trying to address this issue. So one of them is to help the state offices and the governments in general to have the national ID systems. So with that, it's easier to get information on the different population groups and then make sure that they're included in the census and in surveys. We're still trying to get there. We're still far from being very effective in that area, but this is one of the steps. then we try to do some adjustments to the weight, but I'm not sure they are, because if the census is not covering this group of population, then it's really difficult to cover them. There are methods, I think, that are being implemented, like trying to link administrative data with census data, with other information to make sure that the coverage. But as you said, people who are living in the favelas are maybe not recorded in any place in the system. So they will be excluded, unless there is a wide initiative to give them national ID for them to be recorded within the system. And for example, these initiatives for social protection measures and so on can help in that regard. Because if people are motivated to be within the system because they can get some benefits, then this will help the recording. But it's still a big problem in many countries. And Anna, also, I completely agree with you. There is a lot of bias and misreporting because people are afraid to lose their access to social protection. And actually, this is one of the issues we faced in some sub-Saharan Africa, where they implemented big social protection programs. And then we tried to collect information on, who is benefiting from this program, how much they are getting, how they are investing the money they are getting, and so on. And people were reluctant to answer because in some countries, we showed that there is a lot of leakages to non-poor population in the program. And then also, a lot of poor were not covered by the program. So as soon as you undertake initiatives to reallocate and to improve the targeting, of course, a lot of people will lose access to this, and this creates a precedent for people not to answer. So here again, I don't have a specific answer on how to do it, but I think so if you're collecting information on consumption, it's easier than collecting information on income, because people do not necessarily, if you ask someone how much you earn, it's not as you ask someone, how much did you spend on food, so they don't necessarily make this immediate link to the benefits they are receiving. And since in Latin America, all the poverty measures, all the welfare measures are based on income, so underreporting can be a serious issue. So probably one way to address this is to collect information on income and consumption at the same time. And probably also non-welfare measures can help, because if you ask people whether they have access to safe drinking water, whether they have piped water, they cannot lie about this. And then match this with the social protection programs, the maps that have been used, propensity score matching methods. All these methods can help to reduce the bias, but I don't think we can eliminate it definitely. Abhay, I didn't get the point you tried to make, so probably you can be more specific on your questions. So we'll get back to that after I answer Carmen's point. So Carmen, so there are two ways for identifying the vulnerable population. One of them is try to look at, so in the past, before the COVID, well, we tried to look at those who are like 10% or 5% above the poverty line, considering them as vulnerable because they are exposed at high risk to falling back into poverty, and look at their profile. Since the COVID, we included in the vulnerability indicators specific factors that are related to the sectors that are hardest hit by the pandemic, based on the type of contracts or type of wages they are receiving, and based on the responses that we are getting from on their coping mechanisms, like whether they did, for example, borrow from friends, whether they did sell some of their items to identify the profile of the vulnerable. But still, I mean, we're still learning in the process. We're still trying to adjust these measures. Another way also of identifying the vulnerability profile is now also, so we have in the past the MPI, but by revising also the dimensions probably of the MPI after what we have learned from the COVID, this will also help to identify the vulnerable. So Abhay, back to you.
It was not basically a question. It's more of complementing to what you said, and the first one was mostly to hear your reflection on instead of on the fact that instead of measuring annual poverty level by just one-shot survey, could it be more helpful to have seasonal poverty where we collect data on monthly consumption, or at least at monthly level, and then what we see, for instance, from some of the studies that I know is there is a lot of seasonality in poverty, and because of that, the single shot survey that we use for construction and extrapolation of annual consumption is probably not accurate, right? So yeah, it's more of on the seasonality of poverty and the rationale for competing seasonal poverty rather than just a single shot aggregate poverty.
Okay, thank you so much. Look, the objective of poverty is really to understand people whose permanent welfare is below a certain threshold. So if a country decides that they want to understand the seasonality of poverty, fine, they can do it. But the overall concept is built around identifying those who are constantly not able to meet certain threshold, whether it's related to monetary poverty or multidimensional poverty, but we want to have, decent life, okay? So, and that's why we don't focus on the seasonality aspects. Now, I agree that if we take the example of monetary poverty, then we will have a seasonality issue. And this related to the fact that people are involved. So food, for example, depends on the seasonality of production. So after a harvest period, people will have much higher own consumption or even overall consumption because they sell their harvest, they are having higher income, and then they can spend more. Before the harvesting, many people are just starving. They are simply starving. So depending on when you collect the information, you will have a different measure of poverty. So one way of addressing this, some countries decide to go with annual data collection. So they implement the survey over 12 months to make sure that they cover all the seasons. But this is extremely costly. And then in many countries, they will implement a diary for 28 days or 30 days, just to make sure that they are they also adjust their sample according to this, making sure that, because in many countries also the harvest periods will be different from one region to another. So just make sure that we cover the pre and post-harvest seasons. But it is extremely costly, and more countries are trying now to avoid this. And there is this new initiative where they are trying to harmonize methods of data collection going through 2 seasons. So you collect information for 3 months post-harvest and for 3 months pre-harvest. And then you aggregate over the 6 months, so it's way less costly. It's half the cost actually for collecting over 12 months. But we're still struggling with that because in some countries they will say, like Cameroon, for example, is a country where there is a very large variation in the harvest seasons from one region to another. And the conflict in some region add to the problem. So sometimes you know that the conflicts intensify in some periods, so you don't go there to collect the information during them. So this is really a problem we're trying to deal with, but there are some ways to address this by just looking at what are the most common seasons for pre-harvest, try to collect the information during these 2 seasons to make sure that we kind of cover the fluctuations that are created by this. So just before we go back to collection of more questions, I have a question here on the chat from Agnes. I think she had a connectivity issue, so she's asking her question through the chat. So she said that at the CSIA conference in 2016, the World Bank researchers said that we should not continue to use the CPI and the other classical ways to correct data, but they were not able to provide the new measures. I would like to know if the World Bank now new ways to correct. Well, no, I don't think so. Right now, we continue to use the CPI to, so I don't know. I mean, I'm not aware of this discussion, but all I know is that there has been a revision of the PPP. So in the past, we used to use the Purchasing Power Parity Index of 2005. So we use the CPI to bring the consumption level, to adjust the consumption level and bring them to 2005 prices and then use the PPP. But recently, the PPP has been revised to 2011. And very recently, the PPP remained for 2011, but it has been improved and adjusted for some countries to better reflect the differences in purchasing power parity between countries. And now we're working on the 2017 PPP. Now, for adjustment over time, we continue to use the CPI. For adjustment within the country, either we have regional CPIs, so this is what we use. Otherwise, we rely on unit values to estimate the differences in cost of living. Over to you.
I don't know if you have more questions. A lot of people have needed to go, so we're a few of us staying. But if there is any other question, it's I think I'm not sure if Nadia can stay. That's the key thing. Nobody else?
I'm happy to stay. I'm happy also to share additional information for some specific questions or material.
I think we
and then
presentation as well.
Sorry?
To share the presentation.
Yeah, you have it. So go ahead.
Yeah, I have it, but I think the rest of the rest of us don't. So maybe we can share it with everybody.
Yeah, no. This is what I meant. I meant since you have the presentation and since you are the boss here.
Okay. I will share it with everybody.
And the other thing also is, since I think this brainstorming session before we continue forward with the webinars is a very great idea. So probably also we can have reflections on how we can make also the presentations more relevant. You know, if there are specific issues that were not covered or questions that were not answered during this, so we can do this.
Yeah, you can reach us with any suggestions and recommendations for future webinars as well, because this is the first one of the series and it's going to be a learning process for us as well. So yeah, but thank you very much for you that stayed and for everybody that connected. And thank you, Nadia, for being the first brave one to present to the group. And well, we hope to see you again next year, and we hope to receive new proposals for webinars next year. Well, enjoy the rest of the year, this weird year, and see you next year.
Thank you, Nadia. It's great.
Thank you so much. Happy holidays to everybody.
Yes,
Hope
yes.
that 2021 will be better than 2020, and
We
no
hope.
more COVID.
Yes.
No more
Good
shots.
vaccines.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Yeah, enjoy your vacation. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Carmen.